Okay, so the last video introduced consumer and producer surplus and just kind of what they are. And so this is the same picture as I was working on last time. I just cleaned it up a little bit. And we remember that consumer surplus was this triangle right here in red, and that the area of that triangle was $1,800 in this case. And that producer surplus was this triangle down here in orange, and that was $900. So now we're going to use this model to try and answer some questions. Basically, is trade good? Is trade bad? Who benefits from trade? Who loses from trade? Should we have trade? All these kind of things. So we're going to keep on working in this this imaginary surfboard market that I've created, and kind of try and see if the trade is good or not. So the first question, and this is kind of modeled after your homework, just asking the same kind of questions in general, kind of in a quicker way and without any multiple choice answers. So it says, in the absence of international trade in surfboards, what will the domestic price in the United States be for surfboards? How many surfboards will be bought and sold? So we already found that out. In the absence of international trade, this means with no trade at all, we're going to be right here, where supply intersects demand. We have 60 surfboards that are bought and sold. So how many surfboards will be bought and sold? 60. And what will the domestic price be? Well, we already found that out also. It's 40. So we're just using those right here, the point of intersections. If you want to find it algebraically, you can go set these two things equal. All right, so that will be, the domestic price will be $40 and 60 boards will be bought and sold. Simple enough. So now is where we start to introduce some new things. And the question goes like this. If the U.S. could trade surfboards freely, this means with no cost of trade. Gas is free, transportation is free, and obviously all of these things are barriers, but we're trying to make it simple first so that we can get some solutions and then kind of back out and see, well, what happens in the real world when it's not that simple. So it says, if the U.S. could trade surfboards freely at zero cost with the rest of the world at a price of $50, how many surfboards will be produced in the United States, and how many will be consumed? So another word for consumed, I guess, is bought. So we can say bought. And let's go think about how we can approach this. The first thing is that we know that the rest of the world will buy surfboards at $50. And it says, it doesn't say anything about the quantity. They will just buy as many surfboards as they can get at $50. So let's go ahead and draw that in this kind of bright magenta color. And we're going to draw that as a line right here at price is equal to 50. So this is the line, P is equal to 50. And what that's saying is that the rest of the world basically just wants surfboards, as many as they can get at $50. Maybe because the U.S. produces the best surfboards, we actually probably do. Maybe they don't have the means to produce them, maybe they just want U.S. surfboards, who knows. But they'll pay $50 a pop for them in this model forever. And obviously that's not realistic, but it just makes the math simple. So it says how many surfboards would be produced in the United States? Well, that's pretty simple. Even though at this point we don't know how many surfboards are going to be bought in the US, we'll get there. We know that the US producers will supply this amount of surfboards, which is, let me go figure this out. Supply is 10 plus 1/2, or price is equal to 10 plus 1/2 times the quantity. So this is we're going to go back here to our supply line, and we are going to say that we're just going to plug in 50 for P. So we are going to go ahead and say that Q supplied is equal to negative 20 plus 2 times 50. And as you can see, that's just plugging in 50 right there for P, which graphically is finding out what the X value is of that point. Alright, so we have this 2 times 50 is 100. This will be 100 minus 20, which is equal to 80, is equal to our quantity supplied. So again, that is just the value of domestic supply, the value of supply in the US when price is equal to 50. Graphically, it is the intersection of the line where price is equal to 50 in the supply curve, and algebraically you just plug in 50 for price in the supply equation. So we get the answer that 80 is equal to the quantity supplied. So there will be 80 surfboards produced in the US. How many will be consumed or bought? And this takes a little bit more intuition and a little bit more thinking. So before, you could buy a surfboard in the US for $40, right? Because we couldn't trade. And now, the US producers can get $50 a board, shown by this point. They can get $50 a board in the rest of the world. So why the hell would they ever sell a board for $40 in the US? The answer is that they won't. They'll only sell a board for $50 because if they aren't going to get $50 in the US, they'll ship it somewhere else in the world for free. And the rest of the world will pay them $50. And they would rather get more money than less money, so they're only going to sell boards at $50. And that's the intuition that's kind of tricky, is that because the rest of the world will buy an unlimited amount of boards at $50, every single producer in the US that wants to make a board at $50 is going to make it and sell it for $50, either to the rest of the world or in the US. They don't care. So to find out how many boards will be bought or consumed in the US, we need to go over to the demand line and go ahead and find out how many boards will be demanded at a price of $50. Because since the rest of the world wants it at $50, the US is going to have to pay $50. People in the US are going to have to pay $50 also. So all that we're going to do is plug in 50 into the demand line. We're going to plug in 50 into this P right here. So graphically, it's the intersection of these 2 points, and we can see that it will be at 50, but I'm going to go ahead and show you algebraically also. So the quantity demanded is equal to 100 minus P. So we're going to plug 50 in for P, so 100 minus 50 is equal to the quantity demanded, so the quantity demanded is equal to 50. And this is in the US. I should write that, in the US. Alright, so the next thing that we need to figure out, and I'll do an example where the opposite of this is true also, but we need to figure out would the US be an exporter or importer of surfboards. So I'll do an example. In this case, the US is going to be an exporter, and I'll explain why, but I'll do an example where they're an importer also. So the US will be an exporter of surfboards simply because the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demand in the US. So I'll go ahead and write out a little diagram for you so that this is really, really simple. So if the quantity demanded domestically is less than the quantity supplied domestically, then, and I'll just write then you'll be an exporter. So if the quantity demanded is less than the quantity supplied, which is exactly what we have here, 50 is less than 80, then the US will take those extra 30 surfboards and sell them somewhere else in the world. However, if the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied, then you'll be an importer. Alright, so this all depends on just what price the rest of the world is willing to pay. So because the rest of the world is willing to pay more than we were willing to pay in the US, we're exporting. But if they were willing to pay less than we were in the US, we'd be importing. And we'll do an example on that also. So then the last question, and this is the most complicated and the reason I left it for last, is would US consumers be happy or sad about the opening of trade in the surfboard market? So I want to, and then do the same for producers. And so I want to put this into economic terms. Would US consumers be better off with an open trade in the surfboard market? And so another way of writing this would be, would US consumer surplus be greater in an open market? And so we need to go ahead and find out. And the only way to find out that's ever made sense to me is just to go ahead and look at the graph. So before, the US had a consumer surplus of 1,800. Now that we have a new price of $50 with only 50 people buying surfboards in the US, right here and right here, consumer surplus is now shrunk to this area in blue. And so we know that consumers will be worse off because the area that's covered in blue is less now than the area that was covered in red. And we can actually figure out exactly how much worse off they will be. And they will be worse off by the difference between their two consumer surpluses. So I'll repeat that again. They will be worse off by the difference between their two consumer surpluses. So the area of this triangle now is 100 minus 50 is 50. The height times the base will be 50 divided by 2. So I'm just going to go ahead and write that down here. So without trade, I'll just write out without. With no trade, consumer surplus was equal to 1,800. With trade, consumer surplus is equal to 50 times 50 over 2. Well, 50 times 50 is 2,500 over 2, which, correct me if I am wrong, is 1,250. So consumers in the US were better off with no trade because they got their surfboards cheaper and they got more of them. And we can see that they have become worse off. They were better off by the difference between these two. So if we say 1,800 minus 1,250, that is equal to, you know what, I don't know that I can do that in my head, so I will go ahead and do this. Cross out that 8, that's a 7, 10 will be, so we'll have 0 here, that will be a 5, 7, 2 is 5, 1's cancel. So they will be $550 worse off. And these are consumers. So consumers are $550 worse off. And that's just the difference between their consumer surplus before trade and after trade. So this picture is going to get a little bit messy now, but we're going to go ahead and do the same for producers. And so let's pick a very dominant color. You know what, we'll go ahead and pick black, no, we'll do a dark blue. Okay, so remember, producer surplus is the area below the price line and above the supply line. So the new world price is now $50 a board, and our supply line has stayed exactly the same. So producer surplus will be this area right here. This area right here. This entire thing. And so we can already see that that in blue is bigger than the triangle that was in orange, and we can go figure out exactly how much bigger. So again, it's going to have a height of 40, and now we figured out that this out here is 80. So it will be 40 times 80 divided by 2. So this is now producers. So with no trade, producer surplus was equal to $900. And with trade, it's equal to 40 times 80, no, excuse me, let me go check this again. Let's see, so from 50 to 10 is, yeah, that is 40 times 80, correct. This distance here is 80. So 40 times 80 divided by 2. 40 times 80 divided by 2. So 4 times 8 is 32. Divided by 2 is 1600. Yes. 1600. So we now know that producers are better off by $700. So producers are $700 better off, because 700 is 1600 minus 900. So they are better off. And so I want to point out that because the U.S. was an exporter, producers were better off and consumers are worse off. If it was the other way around, it would all be flipped, and we'll go ahead and show you that in a different video. So the last thing that I want to point out here, and we'll do it in a red, is that this triangle right here is the total gain in surplus from trade. Because, as you can see, this entire area right here, we'll choose a pink, this entire area right here was the same amount of surplus that we had beforehand. That was the surplus when we had no trade, but we gained this red part by trade. And you can go ahead and see that if you kind of rewind a little bit. But so this is what we had before trading with no trade, and then the red part was the gain or the total benefit from trade. So even though consumers are a little worse off, even though consumers are a little bit worse off, producers are a lot better off for trade, and so the society as a whole is better off. And we will go see that the exact same thing is true in an importer situation, and that will be the next video. Alright, so to clarify, the last things that we have, consumers are worse off. In this situation, the U.S. was an exporter. People would want 50 surfboards in the U.S., and the U.S. would produce 80 surfboards at a price of $50. And the entire society would benefit by the difference between 700, which was the gains to producers right here, and 500, or 550, the loss to consumers. So 700 minus 550 is 150. So that is equal to 150. So by opening up this market to trade, everyone is the society as a whole is $150 richer. So the next video will be about a society that imports. See you there.